Dwayne, you're muted.
As someone who grew up and still makes his home in the Eastern Townships, I have a certain personal interest in today's lecture, which deals not only with familiar names and places, but with political and social questions that are not so unlike those facing Canada and Quebec today. What makes a community or a society or a nation? Where does authority come from? How should government work, and in whose interests? Why and under what conditions might people take up arms to defend those interests? In the first 3 decades of the 19th century, as we shall see, such questions were not just theoretical, they had practical importance for inhabitants of border settlements that lay between the new American Republic in the south and the old French seigneuries. Nor were the answers to these questions a foregone conclusion. Loyalty to one's country is a state of mind, after all, and not a law of nature. Today, we consider 2 seminal events that tested early settlers' allegiance to the British Crown, the War of 1812-14 and the rebellions of 1837-38. We are fortunate to have as our guest speaker one of Canada's most prolific historians, Jack Little, retired professor at Simon Fraser University and author of numerous books and essays devoted to 19th century Quebec. Many of you will already be familiar with Jack's work. His research through the years has explored a wide range of subjects, from early colonization to religion and education to the history of travel writing, tourism, and environmental politics in Canada. In 2008, the University of Toronto Press published his groundbreaking study, Loyalties in Conflict, a Canadian Borderland in War and Rebellion, 1812 to 1840. It tells how people in the Eastern Townships responded differently to these crises and traces the rise and development of what Jack calls a distinctive Canadian identity during a period when the region's population was still largely composed of Anglophones with strong ties to New England and later Great Britain. Heritage Talks Online is a production of the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network and is supported by our major donors, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and Townshippers Foundation. We are also supported by our member organizations in communities around the province, including historical societies, local museums, archives, libraries, and cultural organizations. You can find out more about what we do on our website, www.qahn.org. And if you aren't already, please consider becoming a member. Your paid subscription ensures that Quan can continue to host events like this. In return, you'll receive our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News, and we'll let you know about upcoming talks, conferences, exhibitions, workshops, and special publications. Right now, first-time members get a 30% discount off the price of a 1-year subscription. That's just $20 for 4 issues of Quebec Heritage News. To claim this offer, please message Allison in the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger before the end of today's lecture. Before I turn things over to our speaker, a word for those of you on Zoom. Please switch off your webcam during the presentation. This is to help avoid transmission problems for viewers in regions with limited internet. You are welcome to turn your camera back on during question and answer periods so that you can speak your questions and comments out loud. Just click on the raise hand icon in the bottom of your screen to get my attention. You can also type questions and comments into the Zoom chat box or on Facebook Messenger. Our guest speaker is a native of Quebec who began his studies at Bishop's University and later received graduate degrees in history from the universities of New Brunswick and Ottawa before beginning his teaching career at Simon Fraser University in 1976. He is the author of more than a dozen books, with much of his work focused on Quebec society, religion, and politics in the Eastern Townships. And he's joining us today all the way from Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. Jack Little, welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. And hello, everyone from Salt Spring. Welcome to the Coles Notes version of my book for Loyalties in Conflict. I will try to summarize it as succinctly as I can. Please excuse my voice, COVID before Christmas, and I still have some chest issues, so I may cough or clear my throat a few times. I'm not used to speaking very much either, being a hermit out here in Salt Spring. I want to begin by thanking QAHN for inviting me to give this talk, and particularly Dwayne for organizing it, and Allison for making sure that Zoom is running smoothly. It's always a real pleasure to hold forth about my research on the Eastern Townships. So I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in. It's very gratifying to see how many you are. There won't be a quiz at the end, but I'll leave some time for questions. So sharpen your pencils. I haven't written a lot of Eastern Townships history in recent years, particularly since I retired, but it must have been working on the West Coast. But it so happens that much of my action in my last book came out about a year ago, so I'll make a little pitch for it, reading the diaries of Henry Trent, and that's McGill Queen's University Press. That happened, much of the action happens in Drummondville, and across the river from Drummondville, in fact, where in 1837, just as the rebellion was breaking out, Henry's schizophrenic father built the solid stone house that still stands as a historic site at the Parc des Voltigeurs, which was originally the Trent farm. Norris Trent was a half-pay veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a very wealthy one, and Drummondville had been founded as a British military outpost following the War of 1812. But I suggest in that book that what might at first glance be viewed as a symbol of triumphant British colonialism should more accurately be interpreted as a symbol of its failure in the post-rebellion period, because the Trents did not become the local landed gentry that Norris had envisioned. Eastern Townships had many half-pay officers come, and they wanted to replicate that traditional rural society, landed elite society of England. Most of them failed, and Norris is one of them. His son, Henry, the subject of my book, and who kept a diary throughout his life, was a rather footloose failure until the age of 40, when he returned from British Columbia to marry a local French-Canadian woman, half his age, and she proceeded to give birth to 14 children, and all of them became French-speaking Catholics. So British imperialism ended up being subverted in a way by local French-speaking society. Another digression, if you will permit me, one of the main reasons I was drawn to the history of the Eastern Townships, aside from the fact that I grew up there, is that it provides an excellent opportunity to study 19th century cross-cultural contact. During the French regime, it was preserved as a buffer zone between French and English colonial settlements, therefore remaining a hunting ground for the Abenaki who had settled at the mouth of the St. Francis River at Odenak. After the American Revolution, however, it became a borderland between competing American and British influences. And during the latter half of the 19th century, it became a contact zone between English Canadian and French Canadians who were belatedly flooding into the region. My earlier work, my first couple of books, my PhD thesis focused on French Canadian migration into the Eastern Townships, French Canadian colonization. But then I moved backward in time to focus on the first half of the 19th century. And that hence the book I'm discussing today. To put it in a nutshell, I was interested in how a borderland between the United States and Canada became the borderland that it is today, bordered land, I should say. Finally, what I promise is my last digression. It's essential to know that contrary to popular assumption, and I checked Wikipedia yesterday when I was looking for the boundaries of the Eastern Townships, and under List 3, they still say that the Eastern Townships was settled by Loyalists. But the fact is the great majority of the Americans who first settled in the townships were not Loyalists. And given that historians such as myself have been pointing this out for decades, I can only conclude that the myth serves a need to brand the English-speaking pioneers as more conservative and more pro-British than they actually were. In short, to associate them with the British colonial project in Lower Canada. That said, quite a number of Loyalists did settle in the Missisquoi Bay area, particularly during the War of Independence, but most of them subsequently obeyed Governor Haldimand's order to move on to what would become Upper Canada in 1791. So the Upper St. Lawrence is where most of them ended up. The following year, 1792, is Eastern Townships was officially open to American settlement, and families crossed the border simply to escape high taxes and acquire cheap land. So for those not familiar with the Eastern Townships boundaries, which I'm sure most of you are, but the fact is there never has been a formal place called the Eastern Townships. So the boundaries are rather obscure in a way. I'll ask Alison, though, to show you the map that was drafted for the British American Land Company in the early 1830s. If you can do that, Alison. And as you can see, it dwarfs the old seigneurial zone. There it is. You can see Montreal off to the left and Quebec City just to the right, and the townships with the black border around it. Obviously, that map was drafted to make the region look as large as possible. And it has all those road arteries. Some of them didn't yet exist. But my own publications have nevertheless tended to follow essentially those borders. I define the Eastern Townships as all freehold land between, the Yamaska Richelieu up to the west, the Chaudière to the right, St. Lawrence to the north, and the 45th parallel to the south. So now to move on to the War of 1812. I don't have time. Well, the War of 1812 is mostly about the Southern Townships, but the 1837 rebellion did have some impact in Megantic County, which is where I'm from. I don't have time to discuss the many complex causes of the War of 1812. When I started this project, I was blown away by how many books had been written about it, mostly by Americans, but there are dozens and dozens of them, and you will search them in vain for any mention of the Eastern Townships. It begins with, the major causes were American resentment against the British blockade of continental Europe, the impressment of British-born sailors from American ships, and what the Americans considered to be British encouragement of First Nations unrest in the Ohio country. So 3 main causes. The New England states, however, remained firmly opposed to the declaration of war. And that plays a role, of course, with the Eastern Townships being to the immediate north. The reason for the invisibility of the Eastern Townships in these books, though, is obviously that there were no major battles in the region. And war is about more than military conflict, as you will all know from watching the news about Ukraine. It's also about social and cultural history. It's also about the people who were families who were victims of it. So the situation in the Eastern Townships contrasted with that in Upper Canada, in that, as I've just suggested, there were relatively few Loyalists in the Eastern Townships, twice as many ratio, I think, in Upper Canada. And there was no military garrison in the Eastern Townships, in contrast to Upper Canada. And that garrison actually played a role in Upper Canadian loyalty, such as it was, because it provided, well, of course, it would intimidate anybody who wanted to join the Americans, but it also provided a market for farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, and tavern owners. Also, of course, there's no major body of water to mark the boundary in the Eastern Townships as there is in Upper Canada. Just basically almost imaginary line, at least in the early 19th century, passing through a hilly wilderness, as well as between adjacent Canadian and American villages such as Stansted Plain and Derby Line. Nor did the Eastern Township settlers have much contact with the rest of British North America. Yet they were called upon to serve in the militia and fight their American kin and neighbors if necessary. Understanding their somewhat complex response provides insight into the self-preservation impulses of a rural population caught up in an international conflict with which it had no reason to identify. And to help us understand their worldview, I can't do better than paraphrase historian Jane Arrington's words about Upper Canadians at the time. She writes that their loyalty was confined to those in their family and to the few settlers they met occasionally at the mill, at work parties, and at social occasions. And she might have added taverns and meeting houses, but those two are very local. So people's worlds were very circumscribed. And of course, in the townships, to the extent that the border townships, that they did have external contacts, it was south of the border. By the time the war broke out there were 4 battalions into approximately 50 companies of militia in the Eastern Townships. What was referred to as the sedentary militia included all the able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 50. In addition, a number of men from each company were to be selected from the active militia, which could be called upon to fight outside the region. But the lieutenant colonels of each of those battalions found it very difficult to enforce this regulation. Thus, in December 1812, a conscription crisis developed in the Eastern Townships when the 4 battalions were ordered to supply 80 men, 20 men each, to join the 2 companies that would serve as light troops in the vicinity of Île-aux-Noix on Lake Champlain. Known as the Frontier Light Infantry, their main role was to facilitate movements of smuggled goods into Lower Canada, from Vermont primarily. In response, prominent militia officers, as well as 2 leading Anglican clergymen, signed a petition, and these Anglican clergymen were British Tories, really. They signed a petition claiming, quote, that it is not without great difficulty that the necessary labor for raising crops for the subsistence of the families and cattle can be performed, even when there is no other interruption than the natural one of bad weather. And it is utterly impossible, until time shall have rendered them more numerous and compact, for any of them to leave their families for any considerable length of time without actual ruin, not only to the families of those who were drawn away, but the settlement at large. So it was well-established opposition to that kind of conscription. The fact that those in the active militia were supposed to serve during the pleasure of the American war was obviously a major concern, but recruitment was resisted even after the term was reduced to 1 year. And the sedentary militia term of service was 6 months. So it wasn't only about the length of time you'd be away, it was the fact that you would be fighting somewhere else rather than defending your own homes, or possibly fighting somewhere else. The men did agree to be enlisted. The men who did agree to be enlisted were compensated by an informal system whereby their neighbors either paid them a salary or contributed to a fund that would support their families. I found this very interesting. It's very informal. You won't find it in any official documents, but people got together, and if some young man was going to agree to be drafted for that, then they said, okay, we will help your family get by helping them with the farm work or providing some money to hire somebody. Nevertheless, the quotas of 20 men per battalion were never filled. There was no conscription riot, and there was a major conscription riot in Lachine around this time. But in the townships, there was none, because those who were conscripted and didn't want to go just slipped across the border. And that's what the local authorities always said. We can't enforce this because they will just leave. In the meantime, the American authorities were becoming increasingly frustrated by the large-scale cross-border smuggling that was feeding the British Army in the Montreal area. They were completely dependent on American beef and other goods. And by the agreement not to molest each other that was reached by communities on either side of the border, Colonel Isaac Clark decided to incite what he referred to as a petty war. This is the American Colonel Isaac Clark, as a petty war in the Lake Champlain area by attacking Phillipsburg in October 1813. He and 100 riflemen quickly overpowered the 6 largely unarmed companies of the 4th Battalion, taking 100 prisoners in addition to the 9 killed and 14 wounded. During the following 2 days, they plundered 2 general stores and drove off many horses and oxen. Then stragglers robbed families of livestock, wagons, clothing, provisions, and so on. Although the 100 prisoners of war were not professional soldiers, just local farmers, they were marched south and held for 3 months before finally, I think in Burlington, and finally released in a one-sided prisoner exchange. The reason that the township's militia had been largely unarmed was that the authorities were prioritizing the more strategically important Montreal area, and they did not entirely trust a militia whose members had been resisting the draft to join the Frontier Light Infantry. As late as July 1813, the total of 2,781 men in the Eastern Townships militia had been given only 337 rifles, one for every 8 men, which was much lower than the ratio in the rest of the province. The government chose instead to encourage the formation of volunteer corps of regulars with enlistment bounties of £5 and the promise of land grants after the war. It was one of those companies that succeeded in destroying the American barracks near the border in Stewartson, New Hampshire in December 1813. Clark's attack on Phillipsburg had failed to curtail the lucrative smuggling trade, with the result that there was considerable amount of cross-border skirmishing. One major incident involved, I guess the major incident involved the capture of an American customs collector, Samuel Hugh, after he had shot and killed a Stansted farmer on Canadian soil. Hugh was taken to the Trois-Rivières jail and charged with murder, but a group of Americans retaliated by seizing 5 Hereford Township residents and plundering their houses as well as seizing their livestock. They were held hostage and threatened with hanging if Hugh were found guilty, though subsequently they were released in an informal kind of bail. That's another kind of these informalities that I love. I mean, they said, you can go back to your farm if you promise that if Hugh is hanged, you will come back and go back into our prison. So they trusted them to do that. Anyway, the matter was finally resolved with Hugh's release following negotiations at a very high level between the US Congress and the Lower Canadian government after the war had ended. So Hugh got away with murder, in other words. To conclude this brief discussion of the War of 1812, then, the people of the Eastern Townships could claim that they had passed the loyalty test by displaying their willingness to resist American incursions. But their loyalty was essentially to their families and local communities rather than to the British Empire. The same can actually be said for Upper Canada, despite the myth that followed, because the crucial battles fought in Upper Canada were fought by British regulars, not by militiamen. And militiamen, in fact, after the Americans took over Toronto and so on, just flocked to turn themselves in, and they would sign letters that saying they were once they were released, they wouldn't engage in further resistance. If you want to read more about that, George Shepard's Plunder, Profit, and Paroles is an excellent book. So now I'm going to move on to the rebellion. Historians of the rebellion of 1837-38, I don't know if you want to call them rebellion or rebellions, but it's a 2-part rebellion anyway, have generally assumed that the English-speaking population were nearly all Tory sympathizers, and therefore they've ignored the Eastern Townships, even though most of its settlers were from the very country that inspired the radical Parti Patriote program. And that's one result of having, of course, townshippers identified as loyalists with a capital L, United Empire Loyalists. During the 1820s and 30s, however, mass petitions were submitted from the Eastern Townships demanding road subsidies to improve transportation links to the St. Lawrence, registry offices to enable property owners to raise capital by recording land sales and mortgages, a more accessible court system to enforce collection of small debts in an economy based on credit, and above all, seats in the Legislative Assembly to help gain those economic benefits. So up until 1829, there was one large riding, Buckinghamshire, that extended from all the Eastern Townships pretty much to the St. Lawrence Valley, Trois-Rivières. So effectively, the people in the townships were disenfranchised. The French-Canadian nationalists who dominated the Legislative Assembly had little interest in promoting development of a region that had been colonized by English-speaking Protestants. But the Parti Patriote changed its stance after 1829 when the townships was finally subdivided into 6 electoral districts, electoral constituencies. The Assembly then began to provide generous grants, as well as establishing several registry offices in the region. And this political strategy worked, for all Eastern Townships candidates elected in the following elections were Papineau supporters. There was little reason, after all, for the Eastern Townships people to identify with the Montreal merchants and Quebec officials who held large swaths of their region's land as absentee proprietors. But what caused the most resentment was the imposition of a British office-holding clique. An article in Stansted's British Colonist in 1826 complained that the government, and I'm going to quote part of it here and break into quotes and out, so I'll just read it, Having invited Americans to settle into the Eastern Townships had treated them with distrust, with cold reserve, and a freezing influence bordering on contempt. Once they had cleared the forests and surmounted all embarrassments, both natural and artificial, so as to compose a population of 40,000 souls, the settlers needed internal regulations by which to conduct and manage our little concerns. To carry such a purpose into effect, there have uniformly been sent among us foreigners, unacquainted with our habits, manners, and customs, to fill and execute every official function, thereby declaring in language too unequivocal to be misunderstood that no confidence was to be placed in native-born Americans. And that's where the quote ends. The prime example of this was William Bowman Felton, a wealthy naval veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, who had acquired over 10,000 hectares of Crown land in the Sherbrooke area, including all of the Sherbrooke area, Sherbrooke town itself, and who became a Justice of the Peace, Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th Battalion, member of the Legislative Council, the only member of the Legislative Council from the townships, and the colony's first Commissioner of Crown Lands. His two brothers and two brothers-in-law also received substantial land grants, as well as important patronage positions, including district sheriff and court clerk. Felton had little success in his efforts to have leading roads built into the region or British settlers attracted to his land. But there was a dramatic turn of events in 1833 when the British British government, tiring of the Assembly's constant blocking of money bills, sold most of the region's crown land to the London-based British American Land Company. Aside from providing a financial boost to the executive branch of the government, thereby, getting around the Legislative Assembly's control of money bills, the company's goal was to build the much-needed transportation network and attract some of the British immigrants who were streaming from the port of Quebec into Upper Canada and the United States. The results were disappointing, however, largely because the onset of the rebellion in 1837 stopped the flow of immigrants. But prior to that year, because this was a 3 or 4 year period prior to that, the company's activities and land purchases provided an economic stimulus to the Eastern Townships at a time when the rest of the colony was feeling the effects of repeated wheat crop failures. For now, Willett blames the rebellion in a way on those wheat crop failures. And at a time and when there was an international economic downturn. This obviously played a role in the sudden dampening of pro-patriot enthusiasm in the region, particularly as Lower Canada moved closer to armed conflict. So in the next election before the rebellion, there was only 1 or 2 patriots elected in the townships. At its extremes, the political division in the Eastern Townships was between those willing to risk the increased French-Canadian political dominance that would result from democratic reforms, and those, on the other hand, who argued that such reforms would result in government by a nationalist autocracy eager to drive English Canadians from the province. In the final analysis, however, most residents of the townships were neither American Republicans or British Tories, but political pragmatists who valued property ownership, economic development, and liberal political institutions. In short, they conformed to what historian Ian Mackay has famously referred to as Canada's liberal order framework. That said, there were certainly pockets of Republican support in the region. In 1834, Stansted's MLA, Marcus Child, and I'll put this up because years ago, I published his letters from the 1840s, if you can see it, child letters to his wife every day while he was sitting in the Legislative Assembly in Kingston, very interesting letters. But, and the originals are in the Coaticook archive. So pockets of radicalism. Marcus Child supported Papineau's 92 resolutions, which called for a government responsible to the elected Legislative Assembly, as well as an elected Legislative Council. That, of course, would effectively mean would mean self-rule for Lower Canada. Stansted's reformers then formed correspondence committees to communicate with the county committee, which would in turn communicate with the permanent central committees in Montreal and Quebec City. The aim was to mobilize and direct collective efforts of the population. In reaction, anti-patriot constitutional committees were soon afterward established in other counties. Stansted was more radical or liberal than most of the other counties. Missisquoi was very divided, actually, very conservative, conservative and radical extremes at either end. The constitutionalists were not as in favor of the status quo as is generally assumed, however, for they favored reforms such as a tax on absentee proprietors, landowners, that is, which was a suffocating development of the region, a modified executive council, a more representative legislative council, and a more effective judicial system. People mostly had to go to Trois-Rivières for courts until the 1830s, and an abolition of the seigneurial system. After the rebellion broke out in November 1837, the government delayed filling Eastern Townships militia vacancies, again preferring to support the formation of volunteer companies that it felt would be more trustworthy. The largest one, with 600 rank and file, was the Eastern Townships Loyal Volunteers, under the command of Colonel Frederick Elliott, who had been commanding officer of the Voltigeurs during the War of 1812, as well as the founder of the military colony of Drummondville after the war had ended. A good friend of Henry Trent, by the way, or at least a mentor of him. The only skirmish in the Eastern Townships that took place in December 1837 at Moore's Corner near Phillipsburg, where the Missisquoi volunteers surprised the Patriot advance guard that was carrying arms and ammunition from Vermont to Robert Nelson at Saint-Césaire. Hence, presumably, the construction of the only military blockhouse in Eastern Townships. I thought I'd throw that in because that's an illustration for the talk. I don't know if you can see that on the screen. That photo was taken, I believe, in the 1890s. It's in dilapidated condition by that time, clearly. The volunteers not only seized many of the arms that were destined for Nelson, but they won a major moral victory with the capture of the commanding officer, Robert Shore Mills Bouchette, who was the son of the Surveyor General of the province. Vermont border towns then passed resolutions condemning British tyranny, and Robert Nelson, who had assumed control of the Patriot movement in the United States, decided to launch cross-border raids in order to provoke an incident that would lead to ruptured relations between the US and Britain. You can see a pattern here, the same pattern as in 1812. Get the border people to fight against each other. He also established secret hunters' lodges in Lower Canada, as well as the US, where they became very popular. But Britain had poured over 5,000 seasoned troops into the colony by that time, so the hunters were not in a position to invade, particularly after Washington moved to discourage such activities. The United States government did not want to have a war with Britain at this time. That said, popular sentiment in Stansted County and surrounding area reached near hysteria in November 1838, after two militia officers were fired upon, one of them being wounded on their way home from neighboring Barnstown Township, where they had failed in their attempt to arrest a couple of Patriot sympathizers, local Patriot sympathizers. The government declared martial law, and there followed a crackdown on supposed rebel sympathizers throughout the region. To take one example, when the Georgeville ferry sank, it was assumed to be due to sabotage. I don't know whether it was or not, but that was the assumption made. And arrest warrants were then issued for the prominent village merchant, Chauncey Bullock, and four others. Bullock and a local farmer then fled to Vermont. In my book, actually, I state that it's not clear whether or not these men were involved in a pro-rebellion conspiracy, but I learned only a couple of years ago that Bullock was definitely not. Michel Knowlton, a descendant of his brother, kindly sent me copies of several letters between him and his brother William, written after Chauncey Bullock had returned from self-imposed exile. Those letters reveal that William's resentment of his more successful younger brother had caused him to urge Chauncey's arrest, based largely on his comment that, this is what Chauncey had said in his store, the only thing the people of Georgeville had against soldiers being kept in the village was that it would be safer and quieter without them. So that was enough to brand him as a rebel. And for details on that, actually, I published those letters in November 2020 with commentary in Histoire Sociale, Social History. 15 arrests were made in Barnstown, said by Oaths Commissioner William Ritchie. It was the Stansted Oaths Commissioner, to be full of snagglers. This is a term for counterfeiters, horse thieves, and every other description of border trash. Actually, I'll take a little digression here because you can see on the wall behind me these blue things. I got those from the Knowlton Historical Archive. Marion Phelps gave me copies, and those are counterfeit $3 bills that were printed in the Eastern Townships and circulated in New England, and that was a major source of funds for townshippers in the early 19th century. Okay, where are we? Yes, horse thieves and every other description of border trash, he said. And 11 more men were incarcerated in the Sherbrooke jail for quote, treasonable practices. They included a Hatley militia captain and the brother of Sherbrooke's most influential merchant and politician, Samuel Brooks. His name was George Washington Brooks, so maybe that's one reason he was supposedly sympathetic with the rebels. All this after the rebellion had been effectively quashed. So most of the actions taking place in the Eastern Townships after the rebellion, really. Clearly what those arrests and the dismissal of a number of men from office, men like Marcus Child, amounted to was a settlement of scores. Furthermore, judging from the reports by several clergymen, many families had fled to the United States. There's no way, I guess, of measuring this, but from what some people write, a substantial percentage of the population left. And they, of course, complained that congregations remained internally divided. The rebellion had therefore exacted a price on the region as far as social cohesiveness and economic development were concerned. And matters did not end there, for incendiary cross-border raids by Canadian exiles as well as Americans continued into 1839 and even beyond. Historian Gerald Craig claimed that in Upper Canada, similar raids caused far more alarm, expense, and bloodshed than the rebellion itself. That was also true in the Eastern Townships, at least as far as property destruction was concerned. I don't have an account of all of the raids or property because the Stanbridge Journal, I believe it was called, copies, there's several months of copies missing. The Anglican minister Fraserberg near the border wrote to his bishop in February 1839. This was Reed, his name, Reverend Reed. Since the beginning of our provincial troubles, our situation on these exposed frontiers has been very trying. This winter in particular is dreary, gloomy, full of fears and alarms. Our men are on guard on all the roads which lead to the States by night and day. The men are almost worn out with fatigue and exposure. Should this state of things continue long, I'm afraid that more than half our lands will be untilled, unsowed, and unplanted for want of men to labor. The dire necessity of guarding the country from evil men requires all hands. End of quote. 2 months later, in April 1839, Captain Charles Miller of St. Armand West reported that cross-border raiders had burned to the ground his barn and shed with all the contents, including, I can unstick these pages, including 8 horses, 17 cattle, and a large quantity of hay. The Missisquoi Standard, that's the newspaper that was partly missing, thundered, "How long are the quiet and peaceable inhabitants on this frontier to be burned and plundered with impunity? If the American government will not take care of these villains, how long can it be supposed that our fellow subjects will submit to be robbed of their property and their lives by gangs of pirates and freebooters without visiting them with the retribution which they so justly merit?" Unquote. In fact, 2 barns in Highgate, Vermont were burned down soon afterwards. And it was not until March 1840, almost 2 years after the rebellion had ended, that the provincial troops were finally removed from the border. And like the War of 1812 and the rebellion itself, those raids had served to make the border a much more visible and accepted dividing line. At least that's what I argue. So on that note, I'll end by reading a part of the afterword to my book. I just want to use this history is always interesting when you can focus on individuals, particularly ordinary individuals. So Moses Elkins of Peacham in central Vermont set out for the Missisquoi Valley with his family, 2 hired men, and a cart drawn by 2 oxen on June 27th, 1797, so only 5 years after the townships was open to settlement. He had heard favorable accounts of the land from his brother Josiah, who had been trading with the Abenaki who were still living at Lake Memphremagog. 10 days later, having been joined by 2 other prospective settlers who helped to cut their way through the dense woods from the last Vermont settlement, Elkins became a squatter in what would soon become known as Potton Township. Elkins became a militia captain during the War of 1812, but he was accused of harboring deserters. Isolated by some of the highest mountains in the Eastern Townships, Potton continued to have closer links with Troy, Vermont than with the rest of Lower Canada. In contrast to the other townships, most of its settlers were either Baptists or members of the radical Protestant Methodist sect. Yet during the rebellion of 1837-38, a member of a raiding party from Troy was shot and killed in the house of Elkins' neighboring brother, Salmon. It would be Moses who paid the price in the spring of 1840, 2 months after the British troops had been removed from the border. Unseen arsonists burned down his house, 4 barns, and 2 sheds, as well as the livestock and other contents to a reported value of 765 pounds. As of 1846, the government had still not given Elkins' widow any compensation, based on the argument that the attack had taken place too long after the rebellion had ended. So, to sum up, historians have generally assumed that the Eastern Townships was little affected either by the War of 1812 or the Rebellion of 1837-38, but settlers such as Moses Elkins would obviously not have agreed. While he was closer to the border, his home was closer to the border than most residents of the region, the sense of vulnerability to attack from south of the border would have been widely shared. It was only natural then that those settlers would begin to perceive themselves as other than American, as reflected in the trajectory of Elkins' own story, from squatter to militia captain and then to victim of arson. From being a squatter then, he had little awareness originally we probably had little awareness that there was an international boundary that had not yet been fixed, or at least surveyed. He finally becomes linked to the Loyalist cause through his family's resistance to invaders from neighboring Vermont in 1838. So I believe there is time left for questions, and I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Hi, Jack. Thanks so much for that great condensed version of what is a very informative and deeply researched book. I can see that we've already got some comments in the chat box, which I'll get to in a moment. But I thought I would just kick things off with a question of my own regarding your essential thesis that loyalty during the War of 1812, 1814 in the townships really amounted to loyalty to one's family or local community, not so much a connection to the larger colony, and certainly not to Canada in its entirety, or the Canadas. I have another question. Was there any relationship, in your opinion, between people who actually had land, who possessed land, and those who might not have, in their support for the war? I know it's kind of complicated. The early settlers were families composed of, many of them were landowners, or at least possessors of land, but there were others who weren't. Was this a factor?
Well, that's very difficult to say. I mean, it's not, I hadn't really thought about it. Squatting was definitely a major problem. I alluded to it in my paper. It's one of the reasons there was so much resentment against Quebec officials and so on. And I wrote an article a few years ago in the Canadian Historical Review. I found in the 1841 census that a surprising number of people in the townships were still squatters, like close to half, if I remember right, because absentee proprietors still held so much land. But I think that would have an impact in general in attitudes towards the government. But going back to 1812, there was, it's a long story, but the townships were granted, or half townships, to leaders in this leaders and associates system. And the townships leaders were the ones who were supposed to build the roads and open up the land, right? These leaders were originally Americans, the ones who applied. But then the officials in Quebec City thought that they couldn't trust them. They held up the oaths of loyalty so that they couldn't make legal claim to the land. And they ended up taking over much of that land themselves. So that right there, you've got reason for grievances, not just from, squatters or the average local farmer, but some of the leaders who had invested money in the land themselves. So it's a period which still needs more research, frankly. My chapter on the War of 1812 is not all that long. But I'm just, guessing here.
Thank you. I just want to make point out that there are some comments in the chat box. I'm going to read a couple of them. We have some people joining us who are actually descendants of militia members who were involved in the conflict of 1812. Somebody who is it? Nancy Cunningham writes that my great grandfather. Have I got enough greats in there? Amos Davis, who's actually mentioned in your book, is happy to be here listening. And she adds that he was actually one of the militiamen who was captured. I presume she means in Phillipsburg during the raid, but
down in Hereford Township. So he would have been a Hereford Township farmer, I guess.
Okay. And Albert Smith is Albert Smith has commented that the Battle of Chateauguay 1813, of course, that's outside of the townships, was fought with more militia soldiers than with regular British soldiers. Who else have I got who's commented here? Oh, a question from Albert. He wants to know more about the Caldwell Manor raid of February 1839. So this is on the Vosburg family estate by the Patriots. Have you written about that? Or
I mentioned it briefly as the first stage of that raid, which ended up, hitting Phillipsburg.
Okay.
Clark took over Caldwell's Manor and then went across the body of water. But I don't have any details on that Caldwell Manor. I think it was a fairly quick. The townshippers just weren't prepared, and as I said, not even armed.
Okay. For those of you who are joining on Zoom, I invite you to ask Jack a question of your own directly. You can do so simply by raising your hand. I will see that hand icon I mentioned is in a box below your screen called Reactions. If you click on that, you'll see a place to raise your hand if you wanted to speak your question or comment aloud. We do have one new question in the chat line. It's from Jimmy Manson. Jimmy Manson is a well-known historian of the Eastern Townships. He writes, as you mentioned in your book, my ancestor, Robert Manson, was arrested for his involvement with the Hunters Lodge during the rebellion. Could you give us some more information about the activities of the Hunters Lodges in Canada and the United States?
Oh, well, that's a tough question. There was an article a few years ago, not so long ago, and I've forgotten the journal, about American Hunters Lodges, which showed that they spread all, through New York and very popular. I was surprised that the number that existed there. But Hunters Lodges were originally, it was Robert Nelson's idea, and they were to be established in the L'Acadie area, and but as secret organizations, I don't think we have a very good grasp of them. And of course, they weren't in the end able to fulfill their needs. They didn't end up, I don't think, stirring up that much trouble actually on the Lower Canadian side, just because of the presence of the British troops. And but yeah, I mean, who was in them and so on. I think I talk a little bit about them, but I can't really add anything more than what's in the book, Jimmy. I'm sorry. And hello, don't think I've ever met you, but I've read your book, and you're one of the few people who are working on that really early period. So that's good.
So another more research needed.
Oh,
I'm going to ask Jane. I'm going to turn Jane Jensen's camera and microphone on now, because she has a question that she would like to ask. Allison, if you're there, maybe you can make sure that Jane's camera is on. I'm not actually able to do it. Hi, Jane.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. I had to sit up. I was lying down. I didn't think you were going to turn the camera on. So thank you very much for the talk, which, as you've pointed out at the beginning, was really going to be a condensed version of a really excellent book. And as it got condensed, there was one little question which I lost track of, and I wonder if you could go back over it. It was about the people who left the townships to go into Vermont during the rebellion. And because we know in Quebec history that a lot of patriotes moved into Vermont to get away from threats of prosecution. But it sounded in your talk as if there were also English speakers moving into Vermont or quitting Quebec because of the troubles. And I wondered if I understood that correctly, or if it was still basically the standard story of the patriot leaving to go to the United States to protect themselves from being prosecuted.
No, it's not just the French Canadian patriot leaders and so on. It's but there's no way of measuring how many townshippers went across to Vermont or New Hampshire, and many of them came back afterwards too.
Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, talk in the book about, again, don't know numbers, but do know the reaction, right? Local JPs and so on, conservatives, are saying, what should we do about these people coming back? You know, should we arrest them? They deserve to be arrested. They're rebel sympathizers. I think for the most part, they were just left alone. But how many went back and forth, there's no way of knowing. As far as I know, I don't know how you could measure that. Maybe
Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks very much.
Thanks, Jane. Our next question comes from James Little. James, if you could unmute yourself and turn your, I guess your video is on. You're next. Go ahead.
And there we go. Okay. Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Dr. Little, for this talk. And I did recently read the book, which I found very interesting. One thing that you, going back to the War of 1812, one thing that you mentioned briefly in today's talk and also in the book is that there were a number of border communities that made agreements not to raid each other during the War of 1812, Stansted being one. Can you tell us some other communities that had this agreement with their counterparts on the American side of the border?
No, I'll have to confess that I don't have any concrete evidence of that. I mean, it's just stated that he wants to put a stop to this, but he doesn't. There aren't any. I haven't seen evidence of which ones did it. I assume, would be Stansted, Derby, BB, and so on. I think probably over at Stewartston and whatever was on the Canadian side of the border, because those people in Hereford Township, they're quite isolated. And so Stewartston is where they go to shop and so on. And I imagine there were agreements. I mean, I wrote in a later book on the 1840s in the townships quite a lot about the border enforcement of duties on the border and smuggling back and forth. And it's interesting that, people in Stansted and so on, they might have land on the other side, so they drive their cattle back and forth. They might have a mill on one side and live on the other side. So the border didn't mean, from that perspective, all that much until it starts to be enforced really in the 1840s. And what's interesting is people, I mean, I'm digressing here, but I found it fascinating that in the townships, they didn't want, they would drive out the customs collectors if they tried to enforce this local smuggling back and forth. But they still wanted duties against American livestock, because the United States had duties against Canadian livestock, and Americans could bring their livestock into the Montreal market duty-free. So townships farmers didn't like that. So they had a kind of a dualistic view of the border in a way. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. But we know more about the 1840s because by that time you start to have much better government records, and as the state is establishing itself, you know, at the regional level. That's when you get municipal government and so on.
Thanks, James. I'm going to step in here and remind people that even though you have your cameras on, unless you go to the reactions box below your screen and click on the raise hand icon, I can't know whether you would like to ask a question or share a comment. Now, I have another question in the chat from Ted Cash. He's actually watching us on the Facebook live stream at the moment, and he'd like to know more about fighting at Odelltown, if possible. By the way, in the promotional ad that went out, there was an image of a bass drum and a regimental flag. I think both of those items were part of, well, one of them anyway, was saw a battle at the Battle of Odelltown, and that's in the Hemingford Archives collection, if I'm not mistaken. So Ted Cash asks, can you add any information about fighting in Odelltown? That's kind of outside of the townships, but yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I can't. And again, the book focuses more on the social side of the war than on the military. But if I remember right, there's a very detailed years ago by a military historian named Cruikshank. I'm just checking my bibliography now on the battle in there. No, it's Cruikshank's From Ile aux Noix to Châteauguay, a study of the military operations on the frontier of Lower Canada in 1812 and 1813. That might include what you're looking for. It's a very old article, Transactions of the Royal Society of Canada in 1913. But I read that, and it's very detailed. I notice it's pages 129 to 173, so that's 40 some pages, and then pages 25 to 102. So it's a book, in fact, the length, judging from the length of it. So published in 1913 and 1914. So if you can get Transactions of the Royal Society of Canada, Series 3, Volume 7 in your library, might even be online for all I know. I think you'll get all the details, every nitty gritty detail on fighting around that area.
That's knowing your stuff. Next question, I'm going to go to Fergus Keys. I see Fergus has his hand up, and then Jimmy Manson has a question as well. Fergus, your turn.
Okay. I guess it's just more of a general statement than a question. It's always been my opinion that the rebellion of 1837-38 is probably one of the most misunderstood times. The impression being that it was really a French-English conflict, where really, I think it had a lot more to do with the old power and who was going to control the purse strings and things like that. When you take a look at the leadership, the Nelson brothers, Brown, O'Callaghan beside Papineau, or you take Daniel Tracy Pryor, but running the newspaper and setting up the setup for the rebellion, that it really was never really a super English French event. It was, like I say, it had more to do with power and getting control of money. Would you agree with that, or do you?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I'm partly the reason for writing this book, I guess, in a way, is to broaden the parameters of the rebellion. And yeah, it's interesting that those Anglophone or English-speaking leaders that you mentioned, many of them Irish, they have a more radical project than Papineau did himself. I mean, he didn't want to abolish the seigneurial system. He was a seigneur. He didn't want to get rid of the privileged position of the Catholic Church and so on. And whereas some of these others coming from their Irish background were quite radical. I'm not sure if it's about money, but it's partly also, being Irish, being not liking the British. So sympathizing with, an attempt to break away.
I agree.
They had effectively a radical ideology.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Fergus. Jimmy, I see your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Excuse me, Jack, it's good to see you again. Really, my question was co-opted by the previous question, but I'll try to amend it somewhat. I know you mentioned in the book that you reject Durham's idea that the rebellion was caused by two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. Having said that, I think you probably also suggest, or certainly some historians have, that Papineau's emphasis on expanding the seigneurial system into the townships, and also the anti-English rhetoric that accompanied some of his speeches just before the rebellion may have had something to do with muting interest among English residents towards the rebellion. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think Papineau sabotaged, his cause in the townships when he made that, apparently in a speech about expanding the seigneurial system. I think he tried to backpedal a little bit by saying only the British American Land Company land this would happen. But still, of course, people in the townships were not keen on that in any way. It would be a reason for, and was very effectively used by the Tories, by the constitutionalists in the townships to say, look, this is what's going to happen if the rebellion succeeds, or if the Patriots get what they want. I wouldn't say it's a cause for the townshippers to rise up in arms against it, but I would certainly a reason why that pro-patriot sympathy faded pretty quickly. There was, and it was not because they had become more conservative, but because they'd become a little bit more frightened about their minority position.
Does that answer your question, Jim?
It does, yeah. I just, I had to reconfigure the question because of the previous question. But yeah, certainly, as the previous question implied, it has been surmised by most historians who've written about the rebellion that it was simply an English-French conflict in the province of Quebec, or in Lower Canada. And I don't think the evidence supports that. I think there were, I know certainly my ancestors arrived here in the 1790s, had a town named after them. And some of them, quite frankly, were on the side of the rebellion during the 1830s. In Robert Manson being arrested for his activities with the Hunters Lodge. And I had one of his sons was mysteriously killed in a Sherbrooke jail in 1837 by a sword, or a swordsman. So it's a lot more complicated than I think some people would suggest. There were a lot of Americans who, and we see in the Stacy book also, there's a certain amount of antagonism towards the Americans among recently arrived British citizens or British residents. So yeah, it's a very, very complicated question. I think we can't simply break it down along ethnic lines in terms of who supported and who opposed the rebellion.
Yeah, if I can just add a word there. There's a book that came out not too long ago before mine was published by Gilles Laporte, Patriotes et Loyaux, which is does complicate the picture, because he sees it largely as, he looks at it from a local perspective, right? And he sees a lot of what's going on as the rebellion can be examined from local rivalries and so on. To a certain extent, Alan Greer's book did that as well. So it's when you begin to look at it more under a microscope, it just gets more complicated. He does include the townships to some extent in this book as well, but makes some mistakes and doesn't really, it isn't as comprehensive as mine, but it is the first book to really look at the rebellion at a broader level than just Montreal and the Richelieu Valley and Saint Eustache.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thanks for that answer, Jack. A couple more comments in the chat line that I find interesting. First of all, a correction, and Heather Darch has kindly corrected me. Everybody can see that. How embarrassing. The 1838 Odelltown drum is actually located in the Missisquoi Museum. I misspoke earlier and I mentioned it having been kept by the Hemingford Archives. Sorry about that. Of course, she is correct. And I'll just take the opportunity to remind everybody that Quan has a website called 100 Objects, in which the Odelltown drum actually features. It is information on a lot of physical objects, things that have stories behind them that relate to Quebec history and heritage. The Odelltown drum is one of them. Check that out on 100 Objects by Quan. Glenn Patterson makes the comment that there was a similar battle, if you will, in Upper Canada near his hometown in Newmarket. I think I know what he's talking about. A militia of religious farmers mostly went toe-to-toe with the British forces near a tavern on Yonge Street, just north of the city. And finally, a comment from Fred and Sandra Hurd. She writes, Jack, great to see you in person. You had met my father, Lionel Hurd, in the mid-1970s. Captain Samuel Hurd was registered as a militiaman in 1812, and later Captain Edmund Hurd was registered in 1837. Thank you for defining the difference between militia and regular army, as I was not aware of that difference. Also, I want to thank you for your help while I was writing my own book, Footprints into Newport Townships, revealing a hidden history of lives lived. Really enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for the kind words.
And I think at this point, at this juncture, I will also offer my thanks on behalf of the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network to you, Jack, for a great discussion, great presentation. There's been a lot of interest in this, not surprisingly. You are a treasure in some ways here in the townships. I know from working in the field that many people often cite your work, and I look forward to your annual visits back. So thank you so much for being with us today. Allison, thank you for your technical support. Our next online lecture is February the 2nd with the educator and community historian Ken Dolphin, who will be taking us on a virtual tour of historic Valleyfield. This is a classic Quebec company-run town like the one I grew up in, that for many generations supported a large English-speaking textile working population. So more talks are coming in the weeks ahead. Please be sure to check out the entire Heritage Talks program on Quan's website. Until next time, everybody, be well, stay curious. Thank you for supporting us. Take care.
Thank you.